How would you feel if I told you that 65% of you watching right now would administer a lethal electric shock to a stranger?
105 volts.
Not to save your life or the life of a loved one, but simply because a man in a lab coat told you to. Today, we're covering the most unsettling and controversial psychological studies ever conducted. Ones that attempted to pull back the curtain on human nature and to push science beyond what is considered ethical today. In 1961, the world was glued to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a key architect of the Holocaust. But when he was captured, he wasn't some foaming at the mouth monster. He was a bland, boring bureaucrat. His defense for what he had done was simple and absolutely chilling.
I was just following orders.
That phrase horrified the world, and it deeply troubled a young Jewish psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram. He was haunted by a single question. Could it really be that Eichmann and his countless accomplices weren't all sadistic psychopaths? Could they have really just been ordinary men doing their jobs? So he designed an experiment to find out. The question Milgram posed was simple. How far would an ordinary person go in obeying an authority figure if it meant causing harm to someone else? So he placed an ad in the local paper seeking men to participate in what he called a study of memory and learning. The participants were a mix of ordinary people, teachers, engineers, postal workers, and so on. Inside the lab, each participant was introduced to Mr. Wallace, who was an actor disguised as another participant. They were also introduced to the experimenter, a man wearing a lab coat. But here's what the participants didn't know. Both of these men were actors. One of the participants would be assigned as the teacher and the other as the learner. The teacher was instructed to read out a series of word pairs, something like blue box or nice day.
Blue girl. Nice day. Fat neck.
Then the teacher would test whether the learner had memorized the word pairs. For every wrong answer, the teacher was instructed by the experimenter to administer an electric shock. And crucially, the shocks would increase by 15 volts with every mistake the learner made. The shock generator in front of the teacher was a large machine with 30 switches, running all the way up from 15 to 450 volts. The teacher and the learner were then separated into different rooms. They could hear each other, but they couldn't see each other. But to determine who would play which role, the experimenter held a draw. Each person picked a slip of paper, but the slips were rigged. The real participant always ended up as the teacher, and Mr. Wallace the learner. At first, Mr. Wallace got answers wrong and received small shocks. He grunted, nothing alarming.
You'll now get a shock of 105 volts.
But as the voltage climbed, things changed. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were painful. At 150 volts, he cried out,
I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here.
This was the moment most participants would stop, turn to the experimenter and ask, should we really keep going?
There's a lot of them here, they have a heart condition there. You want me to go?
But the experimenter, calm, professional, and unmoved, responded with one of only 4 scripted phrases. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on. That was it. No threats, no punishment. Just the quiet, persistent pressure of an authority figure telling them to keep going. And most of them did. As the shocks escalated, Mr. Wallace's protests became more and more desperate. He complained about his heart. He begged to be let out.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here.
And then, after 330 volts, he went completely silent. No more responses, no more banging, just eerie silence. When the learner provided no response, the experimenter informed the participants that no response counted as a wrong answer, and that they should continue administering shocks. Many participants were in visible anguish. They were sweating, trembling, and stuttering. Some even broke out into fits of nervous, uncontrollable laughter.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here. Let me out.
They were caught between their own conscience and the authority figure in the lab coat, and they couldn't find the exit. Before the study, Milgram had asked psychiatrists and colleagues at Yale to predict the results. They guessed that only around 1% of participants, those with genuinely sadistic personalities, would go all the way up to 450 volts. In the most well-known version of the experiment, where the learner's voice could be heard but he wasn't visible, 65% of participants, 2 out of every 3 ordinary people, delivered the maximum 440 volt shock. These were people who were clearly distressed by what they were doing, but did it anyway.
You're going to keep giving what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue.
Milgram's conclusion: obedience to authority is so deeply wired into us that it can override our own moral judgments, especially when we can pin the responsibility on someone else. In this case, the man in the lab coat.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine. Correct. Please go on.
Now, the study was immediately controversial, and it's worth being honest about its criticisms. Researcher Gina Perry examined original recordings and found that experimenters sometimes used prods beyond the 4 scripted ones,
Well, whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word pairs correctly.
potentially applying more pressure than the official design allowed. In 2009, psychologist Jerry Berger conducted a partial replication, stopping at 150 volts for ethical reasons. He found that approximately 70% of participants were still willing to continue past that point, a figure remarkably close to Milgram's original results. The lesson Milgram left us with is this: our moral compass isn't as fixed as we'd like to think, that under the wrong kind of pressure, most of us are capable of doing things that would normally horrify us.
Why didn't you just stop?
He wouldn't let me. I wanted to stop. I kept insisting to stop, but he says no.
Now, Milgram's study showed how authority can make ordinary people do terrible things. The next question was equally as unsettling. What happens when you don't just give someone orders, but give them power over others? What if it's not merely pressure from above, but authority itself that corrupts us? In the summer of 1971, Stanford psychologist Philip Zimbardo converted the basement of the university psychology building into a mock prison. He recruited 24 college students who had been screened and found to be psychologically healthy. These were ordinary young men with no history of criminal behavior or psychological issues. Then, with a literal flip of a coin, they were randomly assigned to be either a prisoner or a guard. Prisoners were arrested by real police officers and driven to the prison. There, they were photographed and given a smock to wear. A chain was locked around their ankle as a constant physical reminder of their position. Guards wore khaki uniforms and reflective sunglasses designed to prevent eye contact. The experiment was planned to run for 2 weeks. It lasted only 6 days. By the second day, prisoners had organized a rebellion. The guards responded by blasting them with fire extinguishers, stripping them naked, removing their beds, and throwing the ringleaders into a small dark closet they called the hole. From there, the situation escalated rapidly. Prisoners were forced to do push-ups, sometimes with a guard standing on their back. Middle of the night counts were held for hours, purely to disorient and exhaust them. Bathroom access was denied, and prisoners were forced to use buckets in their cells, which the guards then refused to let them empty. Prisoners began to break down. Less than 36 hours in, one had to be released after experiencing acute emotional disturbance. Some guards, meanwhile, seemed to relish their position. Zimbardo himself wasn't immune. He had taken on the title of prison superintendent, and he got so absorbed in his role that he lost all scientific objectivity. When prisoners broke down, he didn't see a reason to stop the study. He saw it as evidence that his hypothesis was working. The experiment ended only when a fellow psychologist and Zimbardo's partner at the time, Christina Maslach, came to conduct interviews. She was immediately horrified by what she saw and confronted Zimbardo, who ended the experiment the next morning. The original conclusion seemed clear. The situation had won. Ordinary young men had become either brutal enforcers or broken passive victims, purely because of the roles they had been randomly assigned. But this is where the story gets complicated. In the years since, the experiment has come under intense criticism, with many now calling it a theatrical stunt rather than a real experiment. Critics point out that the guards weren't just becoming cruel on their own, they were actively encouraged by the researchers.
The guards have to know that every guard is going to be what we call a tough guard. And so far, you have to kind of try and get it in you. Whether or not we can make this thing seem like a prison, which is the aim of the thing, depends largely on the guard's behavior.
Now, the Stanford Prison Experiment showed how easily power can shape our behavior. But what about our most basic bonds? The ties of comfort, safety, and love. One psychologist set out to prove that they were as essential as food itself, and his methods would horrify the world. In the late 1950s at the University of Wisconsin, Harlow took infant rhesus monkeys away from their mothers within hours of birth and placed them in cages with 2 artificial surrogates, 2 fake mothers, each designed to test a specific theory. The first surrogate was made of bare wire mesh, cold, hard, unpleasant to the touch, but it had one thing going for it, a bottle attached to its chest, providing all the milk the infant needed to survive. The second surrogate had no food at all, but it was covered in soft terry cloth, something that could actually be held. According to the prevailing theory at the time, the infants should have bonded with the wire mother. She was their source of food. She was the one keeping them alive. The cloth mother, by their logic, was useless. But that is not what happened at all. In fact, the infant monkeys spent up to 22 hours a day clinging to the cloth mother. They'd sprint over to the wire mother when they were hungry, feed quickly, and immediately return. When Harlow introduced a frightening stimulus into the cage, the monkeys didn't run to the wire mother. They ran to the cloth mother and held on. She was where they went when they were scared. She was, in Harlow's words, a secure base. What Harlow called contact comfort. Harlow's work completely changed our understanding of love. Harlow's findings fundamentally changed how hospitals and orphanages approach the care of young children, establishing that physical comfort, touch, and responsive caregiving weren't sentimental extras. They were essential to healthy development. But the knowledge came at a steep price. In later experiments conducted through the 1960s, monkeys were raised in total isolation, in a device Harlow chillingly called the pit of despair. These baby monkeys emerged severely psychologically damaged, rocking back and forth and even hurting themselves. When these socially broken female monkeys were later artificially inseminated, they became monstrous mothers. They were indifferent to their own babies, and many were violently abusive. A creature that had never known love was incapable of giving it. Today, Harlow's experiments are seen with a mix of scientific respect and total ethical horror. Harlow's legacy is a troubling reminder that sometimes the research for knowledge leads us down a very dark path, forcing us to weigh up the value of discovery against the cost of suffering. Now, Harlow's experiments show that the absence of care in early life can cause profound damage. But what about the absence of care in a crisis? What happens when someone needs help and there are people around who could provide it, but nobody does? On the night of March 13th, 1964, a 28-year-old woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked and murdered on her way home. The crime itself was horrific, but the story that shook the nation was a claim published in the New York Times that 38 neighbors had witnessed or heard the attack, and not one of them had called the police until it was too late. 38 people, and no one did anything. The story sparked national outrage. How could so many people do nothing? For psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané, this demanded a scientific answer. They suspected that the very presence of other people might make us less likely to help when someone is in need. This became known as the bystander effect. To test this, they designed some ingenious experiments. In one of those experiments, they had a student come into the lab to fill out a questionnaire. As they worked, smoke would begin pouring into the room from a vent. When people were alone, 75% of them got up and reported the smoke within 6 minutes. But in a second condition where the participant was placed in the same room with two other people, actors who were instructed to look at the smoke and then go back to their questionnaires as if nothing unusual was happening. In this condition, only 10% of real participants got up and reported the smoke. This is what Darlene Latagne called pluralistic ignorance. In an ambiguous situation, we look to those around us for cues. If nobody else is reacting, we assume, even against our own judgment, that there must not be an emergency. In other words, we outsource our interpretation of reality to the crowd. In another, even more dramatic experiment, participants were put in individual cubicles for a group discussion over an intercom. During the chat, one of the voices, an actor, would begin to have what sounded like a life-threatening condition. The key variable was how many people the participant thought were listening. When the participant believed that they were the only other person there, 85% of them rushed to get help. But when they were told that there were 4 other listeners, the number dropped to just 31%. The more people who were present, the less likely any one of them was to help. This is the second pillar of the bystander effect, diffusion of responsibility. In a crowd, we assume someone else will do something. The responsibility is spread so thin that no one person feels its weight. But here's a twist you might not know. The original story of Kitty Genovese was wildly exaggerated by the media. The number of witnesses was far fewer than 38, and some people did try to call for help. Recent large-scale studies using real-world security cameras have found that in over 90% of public assaults, at least one person does step in. This new research suggests that in clear, unambiguous emergencies, more people make help more likely. Still, the psychological forces that Latagne and Darley found are very real, especially in ambiguous situations. You see it in cyberbullying, where a crowd silently watches someone get harassed online. You see it in workplaces, where bad behavior is ignored because no one wants to be the first to speak up. The bystander effect teaches us a crucial lesson. Courage isn't just about acting, it's about being willing to act when everybody else is silent. So far, we've seen how situational pressure can make people harm others, abuse power, neglect the suffering of strangers, and withhold care. But what about the professionals whose entire job it is to recognize suffering and help? In the early 1970s, Stanford psychologist David Rosenhan put psychiatric hospitals to the test. And what he found shook the entire field. The question he was asking was simple. What's the difference between the sane and the insane? Was it a clear objective line or a judgment call influenced by labels and our own biases? He assembled 8 pseudo-patients, healthy people with no psychiatric history. Their mission? To get admitted into a psychiatric hospital. Each of them presented to the hospital and reported a single symptom, that they had been hearing a voice, often unclear, that seemed to say the words empty, hello, or thud. This was the one deception. Everything else they did throughout the experiment was truthful. They told their real names and shared their real life stories. Every single one of them was admitted. 7 were diagnosed with schizophrenia and 1 diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis. Once inside, they stopped faking their symptoms entirely and behaved completely normally. And here's what happened next. Nobody noticed. Instead, every ordinary behavior was filtered through the lens of their diagnosis. When the pseudo-patients took notes, documenting their experiences for the study, nursing staff recorded it as patient engages in writing behavior. When they paced the corridors out of boredom, it was interpreted as anxiety. Their diagnosis had become a frame through which everything was seen, and nothing they did was enough to see past it. To be released from the hospital, they had to do something extraordinary. They had to agree with their diagnosis. They were forced to admit to the doctors that they were, in fact, mentally ill. After the study was published in 1973, the administrator of one prestigious hospital was furious. He insisted that Rosenhan's findings could never apply to his institution. His staff would catch a pseudo-patient immediately. So Rosenhan made him an offer. Over the following 3 months, Rosenhan would send 1 or more pseudo-patients to the hospital. The staff were tasked with identifying them. The administrator accepted the challenge. At the end of the 3 months, the hospital reported that out of 193 admissions, staff had flagged 41 as probable pseudopatients and were highly confident about 19 of them. Rosenhan then revealed to the hospital that he had sent 0 pseudopatients. Like all the studies in this video, Rosenhan's work has faced legitimate scrutiny. But even taking those criticisms seriously, the experiment's core lesson is a stark warning about the danger of labels. It shows how easily we are blinded by our own expectations, and how once we categorize someone, we often stop seeing the person and see only the box we've put them in. So from the lab at Yale to the mock prison at Stanford, from the cages of infant monkeys to the smoke-filled rooms and the halls of psychiatric wards, these experiments paint a deeply unsettling portrait of who we are. They reveal a truth we'd rather not face, that our character isn't carved in stone. These studies force us to look at the world, at history's greatest atrocities, and our own everyday cruelties, and see not the actions of incomprehensible monsters, but the potential behavior of ordinary people in extraordinary situations. They are a mirror held up to our own minds, reflecting our vulnerabilities, our biases, and the dark potential that lies in the situations that shape our lives. They are a haunting reminder that the line between good and evil is perhaps the most fragile line of all.